At Emerald Bay International Airport, what started as a routine check-in spiraled into an unforgettable story of humiliation, power, and redemption. Amelia Brooks, a black woman in a wheelchair, carried herself with quiet grace as she navigated the bustling terminal. However, when airline staff targeted her with mockery, the events that followed shocked everyone and left a powerful message about dignity and justice. Before we dive into Amelia's story, let us know where you're watching from. If stories of resilience and fairness inspire you, be sure to like this video, share it, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Your support helps spread these messages to others who need them. Emerald Bay Airport was alive with the typical chaos of holiday travel. Families tugged overstuffed suitcases, business travelers juggled phones and coffee, and the PA announcements echoed relentlessly. Among the crowd, Amelia sat quietly, her wheelchair moving smoothly over the polished tile. Her emerald green scarf lay softly over her shoulders, perfectly complementing her sharp navy coat. Despite her calm exterior, Amelia's pulse quickened as she approached the check-in counter for Crescent Air. She adjusted her scarf subtly, a habit she had developed over the years. Presentation mattered to Amelia. She never let her wheelchair dictate how others perceived her. But the moment she reached the counter, Amelia felt the subtle shift in the air. "Welcome to Crescent Air," chirped Jenna Davis, a blonde woman in her late 20s, whose overly sweet tone felt more patronizing than polite. Jenna's gaze flickered down to the wheelchair, and for the briefest moment, her plastic smile faltered. Amelia noticed. Beside her stood Brian, a tall man with a perpetual smirk that seemed permanently etched on his face. As Amelia handed over her ID and ticket, Brian leaned toward Jenna, whispering something just low enough for Amelia to catch the edge of his laughter. "I'm checking in," Amelia said evenly, sliding her documents across the counter. Jenna's hands hovered over the keyboard, hesitating as though the simple task of typing Amelia's information had become unusually complicated. "Are you sure this is the right counter?" Jenna asked, her voice dripping with forced politeness. "This line is for first class." Amelia raised an eyebrow, keeping her irritation well hidden beneath a composed expression. "Yes, I'm aware. Seat 2A. Jenna's eyes widened slightly before she recovered, pasting on another artificial smile. "My mistake," she said, her voice laced with mock cheer. "We just don't see many." Jenna trailed off awkwardly. Brian snorted under his breath, barely bothering to hide his amusement. Amelia noticed the quick glance he exchanged with Jenna, but she remained calm, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Jenna resumed typing, noticeably slower than necessary. As she processed the ticket, she glanced conspicuously at Amelia's wheelchair. "So, will you need someone to help you get around? Airports can be tricky for people like, well, you know." Heat crawled up Amelia's neck, but she met Jenna's gaze without flinching. "I'll manage just fine, thank you," Amelia replied. Her tone sharp enough to slice through Jenna's false pleasantries. Jenna exaggerated a shrug. "All right, if you say so." As Jenna handed over the boarding pass, it slipped through her fingers, drifting to the floor. Brian snickered softly. "Oops. Better practice those reflexes," he murmured, just loud enough for Amelia to hear. Amelia bent down slowly, retrieving the pass with deliberate care. As she rose back into her seat, she locked eyes with Jenna. "Everyone deserves respect," Amelia said quietly, her voice steady and strong. The weight of her words lingered in the air, heavy as a stone. For the first time, Jenna's smile faltered. "Of course, have a great flight," Jenna replied, though the warmth in her tone was long gone. Amelia didn't respond. She simply turned and wheeled herself toward security, her back straight and unyielding. As she moved away, she caught Jenna's voice trailing after her. "You'd think she'd be used to it by now," Jenna muttered. Brian chuckled. "Some people just like making things difficult." The sting wasn't new. Amelia had endured far worse. But the cruelty, even in its smallest form, still cut deep. She clenched her jaw and pressed forward, silently repeating the mantra she had carried with her for years. "Don't stoop to their level. Rise above it." As she approached the long security line, Amelia took a deep breath, preparing herself for what she suspected might become yet another ordeal. But somewhere deep in her chest she felt it, that quiet pull. Something about today felt different. Unbeknownst to Jenna and Brian, the winds of justice were beginning to stir. Amelia Brooks guided her wheelchair steadily through the winding security line at Emerald Bay International. The low hum of conveyor belts and the occasional sharp beep of metal detectors filled the air, blending into the symphony of airport sounds. Amelia remained calm, her hands resting lightly on the armrests, her posture unshaken. She had navigated countless airports before, well aware of how moments like these could turn into something far more difficult than necessary. A few spots ahead, a family struggled to wrangle two squirming toddlers while juggling shoes and jackets. Behind her, a man grumbled loudly about the inefficiency of the screening process, his irritation growing by the minute. Amelia stayed centered, her face unreadable. She had grown accustomed to being watched, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes with judgment. But she had long learned not to let it show. As the line thinned and Amelia approached the front, her stomach twisted at the sight of Jenna and Brian lingering near the security checkpoint. Jenna chatted animatedly with a TSA officer, her gestures exaggerated and attention-seeking. Brian leaned lazily against a railing, his smirk as smug as ever. Amelia's grip tightened subtly on the chair's wheels. She hadn't expected to see them again, but somehow, their lingering presence didn't feel accidental. "Next," called a TSA officer, waving her forward. Amelia rolled up to the counter, handing over her ID and boarding pass. The officer, a stocky man with tired eyes, glanced at her documents before nodding. "You're clear. Just roll through the scanner. We'll inspect your chair separately." Amelia nodded, pushing herself forward toward the metal detector. That's when Jenna's voice cut through the crowd. "Wait a second." Jenna called out, striding over with Brian trailing closely behind. "I think you should double-check her wheelchair. You never know what people might be hiding." The TSA officer frowned, his eyes shifting between Jenna and Amelia. "Ma'am, we follow standard protocol for all passengers." Jenna's expression hardened just enough for Amelia to notice. "I'm just saying," she insisted, "you wouldn't want to be responsible if something slipped through. Better safe than sorry, right?" Amelia felt her pulse quicken. She turned toward Jenna, her face calm but her gaze sharp. "Is there a problem?" Amelia's voice was low but steady, as solid as stone. Jenna's smile thinned, her saccharine tone returning. "Oh no, no problem at all. I just want to make sure we're being thorough. I'm sure you understand." Brian crossed his arms. "Gotta follow the rules after all," he added with mock seriousness. The TSA officer exhaled, clearly reluctant but unwilling to challenge them. "All right, ma'am, we'll do a secondary inspection." Amelia's jaw tightened, but she nodded. She guided her chair to the side, lifting herself slightly so the TSA officers could begin their inspection. Their hands moved with careful precision over the leather cushions and the small compartments beneath her chair. As they worked, Amelia felt Jenna and Brian's eyes on her, their smug satisfaction thick enough to choke on. She heard soft murmurs from nearby passengers, but no one spoke up. The search dragged on longer than necessary, the officer pausing repeatedly to consult with his supervisor. Amelia sat in silence, her patience unwavering even as frustration simmered just beneath the surface. She knew this wasn't about security. This was about control, about humiliation, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of breaking her composure. At last, the TSA officer stepped back, clearing his throat. "You're all set, ma'am. Apologies for the delay." "Thank you," Amelia replied evenly, though the heat in her chest hadn't cooled. As she turned to wheel toward her gate, Jenna's voice followed, loud enough to reach her ears. "Better safe than sorry," Jenna said with a light laugh. Amelia stopped, pivoting her chair slightly. Her gaze found Jenna's, piercing through the false sweetness. "You should remember," Amelia said, her voice low but razor-sharp, "people notice more than you think, and some actions have consequences." For the first time, Jenna's confidence flickered. Brian glanced sideways at her, his smirk faltering. But Jenna quickly masked the slip with a roll of her eyes. "Whatever you say," Jenna muttered, turning away with a dismissive wave of her hand. Amelia didn't linger. She straightened her back and continued toward her gate, the hum of her motorized chair drowning out the last echoes of Jenna's condescension. The sting lingered, but it was soon replaced by something else. A quiet certainty. Jenna and Brian believed they had the final word, but Amelia knew better. Life, she had learned, had a way of evening the scales, and sometimes karma arrived sooner than expected. As she neared the waiting area, Amelia allowed herself a breath of relief. The digital screen above the gate displayed her flight to New York, and soon this experience would be behind her. But just as she settled near the rows of seats, her eyes caught something unusual. A man sat quietly in the corner, his gaze fixed on her. He wore a dark, tailored suit, his tie perfectly knotted, and polished shoes reflecting the terminal lights. There was something about him, not threatening, but observant. His calm, steady demeanor stood out in the chaos around them. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Amelia glanced away, brushing the feeling aside. She wasn't in the mood for more attention, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this stranger's gaze held something more than curiosity. Amelia Brooks sat near gate 14, her wheelchair positioned by the window, overlooking the tarmac. The hum of conversations and faint chatter of boarding announcements filled the waiting area, but Amelia's focus drifted. Across the terminal, Jenna and Brian lingered near the gate desk, laughing softly and chatting with another Crescent Air employee. Jenna leaned against the counter, gesturing animatedly, while Brian scrolled through his phone, smirking at something on the screen. Amelia sighed quietly, turning her attention to her own phone. She scrolled through her emails without reading them, her thoughts circling back to the security incident. It wasn't new. She had faced moments like this far too often. Still, the weight of it never lessened. Her thumb hovered over her screen as she considered messaging her assistant, Olivia, to document what had happened. But something held her back. Amelia wasn't sure why, but this felt like something she wanted to handle on her own terms. Across the room, subtle movement caught her eye. A man sat in the corner near the gate, impeccably dressed in a dark suit. His silver tie was knotted perfectly, and his polished shoes reflected the fluorescent lights above. His posture was relaxed but alert, as if quietly observing everything around him. There was something about him, not intimidating, but authoritative. His sharp features betrayed little emotion, but his piercing gray eyes seemed to take in every detail. Amelia's gaze met his briefly, and for a moment she felt the weight of his attention. There was a strange familiarity to him, though she couldn't quite place why. She turned back to her phone, shaking the thought away. She wasn't in the mood for further scrutiny, even from a stranger. The minutes ticked by. Amelia shifted in her seat, adjusting her scarf. Her eyes flickered back to the man in the suit just as he stood. He adjusted his jacket with a swift, practiced motion and began walking toward the gate desk. Amelia watched from the corner of her eye, curiosity prickling at her senses. When he reached the counter, Jenna's casual demeanor stiffened slightly. She straightened her posture, while Brian pocketed his phone, the smugness on his face fading just a little. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice low but carrying enough weight to shift the atmosphere. "Are you Jenna Davis and Brian Hale?" Jenna blinked, clearly caught off guard. Yes," she replied hesitantly. "Can I help you?" The man's expression remained neutral, but there was a subtle edge to his tone. "I couldn't help but notice your interaction with one of our passengers earlier." The woman in the wheelchair. Amelia's attention sharpened. She shifted slightly in her chair, watching the exchange with growing interest. Brian's face flushed. "Oh, we were just following protocol," he said quickly, his words tumbling out. "Making sure everything was in order, you know." Jenna forced a bright, artificial smile. "Yes, we always prioritize safety and security," she chimed in. "Is there an issue?" The man didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked briefly to Amelia before settling back on Jenna and Brian. "Actually, there is," he said, his tone hardening. "I'm Mark Lawson, CEO of Crescent Air, and I take incidents like this very seriously." Jenna's face drained of color. Brian's mouth opened slightly, but no sound escaped. The confidence they had so eagerly displayed earlier evaporated in an instant. Mark's gaze remained steady. "Your behavior was not only unprofessional, but completely unacceptable. Mocking and humiliating a passenger, especially one with a disability, violates everything this airline stands for." A hush fell over the surrounding area. Passengers nearby began whispering, piecing together what was happening. Jenna's voice finally returned, shaky and thin. "Mr. Lawson, I didn't mean any harm. It was just a misunderstanding." Mark held up his hand, silencing her. "I'm not interested in excuses. Your actions reflect poorly on Crescent Air and undermine our core values. Consider this your last day with the company. Jenna's eyes widened. Please, I need this job. I can't lose it. Mark's expression didn't soften. Perhaps you should have considered that before treating a valued passenger with such disrespect. Brian stepped forward. Mr. Lawson, if I could just explain. Mark's gaze snapped to him. You're equally responsible, Brian. Both of you are dismissed, effective immediately. Amelia sat in quiet disbelief as the scene unfolded. She hadn't expected justice to arrive so swiftly or so publicly. For the first time that day, she felt a small, satisfying smile tug at the corners of her mouth. Karma, it seemed, had moved faster than usual. Mark Lawson turned toward Amelia, his expression softening as he approached her. Ms. Brooks, he greeted warmly, I wanted to personally apologize for what you experienced today. It was unacceptable, and I assure you, steps are already being taken to ensure it never happens again. Amelia met his gaze, her voice steady. Thank you, Mr. Lawson. I appreciate your intervention. It means a great deal. Mark nodded. Your contributions and advocacy for accessibility in air travel have been invaluable to Crescent Air. I regret that anyone under our employment failed to reflect those values. As they spoke, Amelia could feel the lingering eyes of curious passengers. But for the first time all day, she didn't mind. Justice had found its way to her, and for now, that was enough. Amelia Brooks sat near the gate, her hands resting lightly on the armrests of her wheelchair. Mark Lawson, CEO of Crescent Air, stood beside her. The buzz of murmuring passengers gradually faded as Jenna and Brian were quietly escorted out, Jenna's faint protests trailing behind her until they dissolved into the background. Though the immediate tension began to lift, Amelia could still feel it lingering beneath the surface, like an echo that hadn't fully faded. Mark's calm but commanding presence stayed at her side. After a brief pause, he gestured toward a quieter area near the terminal's large glass windows overlooking the runway. The evening sky beyond was a patchwork of orange and purple, streaked with the final rays of sunlight over distant planes taxiing to their gates. Would you mind if we spoke for a moment, Ms. Brooks? Mark asked gently. Amelia hesitated, searching his face for any hint of pretense. There was none. His expression carried sincerity, but also something else, a quiet regret that seemed to stretch beyond just this incident. She nodded. Of course. Mark guided her to a row of seats by the window, away from curious onlookers. As Amelia positioned her wheelchair, Mark took the seat across from her, leaning slightly forward with his hands clasped. Despite his polished appearance, Amelia noticed the subtle furrow in his brow, a sign of genuine concern. I owe you more than an apology, Miss Brooks, he began, his voice measured and deliberate. What happened today is a failure on multiple fronts, not just by those two employees, but by the systems in place that allowed it to happen. Amelia met his gaze, listening silently. She wasn't sure what she expected him to say, but the weight of his words suggested this was more than just routine damage control. You've been a tireless advocate for accessibility and inclusivity in the airline industry, Mark continued. I've followed your work closely. I know how much thought and effort you've put into making air travel more equitable. And yet, even with everything you've done, this still happened. His jaw tightened slightly. It's unacceptable. The terminal quieted as passengers settled back into their routines, but Amelia felt the moment stretching between them. Thick with unspoken truths, she folded her hands in her lap, her fingers brushing the hem of her scarf as she chose her words carefully. I've faced this kind of behavior more times than I can count, she said finally, her tone calm but laced with exhaustion. It's draining, Mr. Lawson, to constantly feel like I have to prove my worth just to receive basic respect. Mark exhaled slowly and nodded, his eyes darkening with understanding. I can't imagine how exhausting that must be, he replied, and I won't pretend that an apology from me can erase the frustration you've endured. Amelia's gaze softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. It's not just about me. There are countless others who experience this every day. The difference is, I have a platform, they don't. For every incident like this that gets addressed, how many more are ignored? Mark leaned back, his hands unclasping as he absorbed her words. You're right, he admitted after a pause. Addressing what happened today isn't enough. This needs to be a wake-up call. Not just for Crescent Air, but for the entire industry. Amelia studied him carefully. His conviction seemed genuine, but she'd learned long ago that good intentions didn't always translate into meaningful change. "What do you plan to do about it?" she asked, her voice steady but challenging. "Words are easy, Mr. Lawson. Action is what matters." Mark pressed his lips into a thin line, considering her question with care. "We'll start by implementing mandatory inclusivity training for every employee, from ground staff to upper management," he said resolutely. "I'll make sure our policies are enforced more rigorously. But beyond that," he paused, meeting her eyes directly. "I want your input, if you're willing. Your insights have always been invaluable, and I think it's time to elevate your role in this company." Amelia arched a brow, surprised by the shift in conversation. "Elevate my role? How?" "I'd like you to lead a new initiative," Mark explained, "an accessibility task force, dedicated to overhauling our practices and setting new standards, not just for Crescent Air, but for the industry as a whole. You'd have full autonomy and the resources to implement real, meaningful changes." His words lingered between them, and Amelia felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected: hope. But almost as quickly as it surfaced, hesitation followed. She'd heard promises before. She had watched initiatives begin with enthusiasm only to fade into bureaucracy and red tape. "It's a generous offer," she said carefully, "but good intentions won't carry this forward. Change requires commitment and accountability." Mark's expression softened, but there was resolve in his eyes. "I understand, and I'm prepared to be held accountable, not just by you, but by the very people this initiative is meant to serve." Amelia let his words settle, watching him closely. For the first time that day, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "I'll consider it," she replied, "but I'll need to see action before I agree fully." Mark nodded, his own expression easing. "That's fair." He extended his hand, and after a brief moment of hesitation, Amelia shook it. His grip was firm yet respectful, a quiet but powerful acknowledgement of the partnership being forged. As they sat by the window, the tension that had weighed heavily on Amelia's chest seemed to lift slightly, replaced by the faint but unmistakable sense of possibility. The journey ahead would be long. Amelia knew that. But as she glanced out at the dimming sky, she felt a spark reignite within her. It wasn't just about justice for herself. It was about creating a pathway for those who would follow. Amelia Brooks sat quietly by the large terminal window, the soft hum of Crescent Air's bustling gate area fading into the background. Mark Lawson's offer still hung in the air between them, its weight undeniable. His words had felt sincere, but Amelia had heard promises before, so many of them fading long before real change could take root. "It's a generous offer," she said carefully, folding her hands in her lap. "But good intentions alone won't make this work. Real change takes commitment and accountability." Mark's expression softened, and he gave a slow, measured nod. "I understand, and I'm prepared to be held accountable, not just by you, but by everyone this initiative is meant to serve." For the first time since their conversation began, Amelia felt the corners of her mouth lift into a faint smile. There was still caution beneath it, but it carried a flicker of hope she hadn't expected to feel. "I'll consider it," she replied, her voice steady. "But I'll need to see that commitment in action before I fully agree." "Fair enough," Mark said, a small but genuine smile touching his lips. He extended his hand. After a brief hesitation, Amelia took it. His handshake was firm but respectful, grounding the exchange in something that felt real, a rare and fragile kind of trust. As the minutes stretched quietly, Amelia gazed out at the runway. The twilight sky deepened to hues of purple and gold, casting long shadows across the sleek wings of planes parked in neat rows. Somewhere out there, her flight to New York awaited, but her thoughts felt too restless to focus on the journey ahead. Her fingers brushed absently over the scarf draped around her neck, the soft wool grounding her in the present. Yet the memory of Jenna and Brian's taunts lingered, refusing to fully dissolve despite Mark's swift actions. A quiet voice stirred in the back of her mind. Would they have faced consequences if I weren't who I am? The thought stung more than she cared to admit. Amelia's advocacy had given her a voice, a platform that others in her position didn't always have. But what about those without connections, without influence? How many endured the same quiet indignities every day, left with no recourse but to endure it silently? Her chest tightened. It was a sobering thought that never quite left her. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to refocus. Dwelling on the broader injustices, though valid, wouldn't help her here. Not now. There was still more to reflect on, more to consider. Amelia's gaze drifted across the waiting area. Passengers had resumed their routines, scrolling on phones or chatting quietly, slipping back into the comfortable rhythm of travel. Some avoided her gaze altogether, whether out of discomfort or guilt, she couldn't tell. But not everyone looked away. A few rows over, an older woman met Amelia's eyes. Her smile was small but warm, and she gave a soft nod, as if silently acknowledging what Amelia had endured. Amelia nodded back, appreciating the subtle gesture. Even if it had come too late to intervene, it still carried weight. Near the charging station, a young couple whispered to one another, glancing toward Amelia every so often. The man's expression was thoughtful, while the woman seemed to linger on the edge of standing up. Finally, the woman smoothed her jacket and approached. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice tinged with hesitation. "I just wanted to say, I think you handled everything earlier with so much grace. I'm sorry for what you went through." Amelia looked up, caught off guard by the sincerity in the woman's tone. "Thank you," Amelia replied with a faint but genuine smile. "It means a lot to hear that." The woman hesitated for a moment, glancing back at her partner before continuing. "I wish we'd said something when it happened. I wanted to, but I didn't know how to step in without making things worse." Amelia regarded her thoughtfully, appreciating the honesty. "It's not always easy to know what to do in the moment," Amelia admitted. "But the fact that you're thinking about it now, that matters." The woman's face brightened slightly, as though a weight had lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you," she said again, before returning to her seat. As Amelia watched her go, she wondered how many others had faced the same internal conflict, wanting to help, but paralyzed by uncertainty. Small moments of humanity like this one reminded Amelia that change, however slow, was possible. The faint crackle of the intercom broke her thoughts as another boarding call echoed through the terminal. Amelia shifted in her chair, the familiar ache settling into her shoulders after a long day of travel. Her thoughts circled back to Mark's offer, the accessibility task force, the autonomy he promised. It could be an opportunity for real, tangible change, but with it came responsibility, and Amelia knew better than anyone the weight that carried. Advocacy wasn't just about fixing broken systems. It was about enduring the resistance, the dismissiveness, and the uphill battles that came with challenging the status quo. She had fought those battles before, and won. But this felt different. It wasn't just about her. It was about those who hadn't yet found their voice. Amelia Brooks stared out at the fading horizon as the glow of Emerald Bay International's runway lights shimmered beneath the encroaching twilight. Mark Lawson's offer, the task force, the autonomy, weighed heavily on her mind. The victories she had achieved through advocacy were fulfilling, but they had come at a cost. Every step forward demanded energy, resilience, and patience that often felt stretched thin. Could she take on even more? The thought lingered, unresolved, as Amelia's phone buzzed on the armrest. She glanced at the screen. "Melanie, heard about the airport drama. Are you okay? Let me know if you need anything. Also, Mark Lawson called, wants to set up a meeting when you land. Said it's urgent." A small smile tugged at the corners of Amelia's lips. Melanie had worked alongside her for years, sharp, reliable, and always in the know before Amelia even had to ask. Their partnership had grown into something that felt less like employer and assistant and more like two sides of the same coin. Amelia typed out a quick reply. "I'm fine. I'll handle the meeting when I land. Thanks for the heads up." As she set the phone aside, her gaze drifted back toward the tarmac. The last traces of sunset had melted into deep indigo, and the plains outside gleamed beneath artificial light. The scene, though ordinary, felt grounding, a reminder that even amidst stillness, the world continued to move forward. "Attention passengers," the intercom crackled. "Pre-boarding for Flight 312 to New York is now beginning. Passengers needing additional assistance may proceed to the gate." The announcement pulled Amelia gently from her thoughts. She adjusted her scarf and shifted the controls on her chair. As she approached the gate, a new attendant stood waiting. A middle-aged man with a warm smile and kind eyes. "Good evening, Miss Brooks," he said, offering a polite nod. "Let me know if you need anything." His tone carried genuine courtesy, not the thinly veiled condescension she had encountered earlier. "Thank you," Amelia replied, the weight in her chest easing just slightly. "Safe travels, ma'am," he added, guiding her to the jet bridge. Amelia's heart felt a little lighter. The burdens of the day hadn't disappeared, but something had shifted. A seed of resolve beginning to sprout. She may not have all the answers, but she knew this was far from the end. The jet bridge was quiet, the hum of machinery the only sound accompanying Amelia as her wheelchair glided forward. Each movement echoed softly, amplifying the stillness around her. Ahead, the doorway to the plane loomed like a threshold, the next chapter waiting just beyond. As Amelia approached, a flight attendant stepped forward. Her uniform was crisp, and her smile felt warm without being forced. There was no hesitation in her gaze, no awkward glances at the wheelchair. "Good evening, ma'am," the attendant greeted. "I'm Elise. Welcome aboard. Let me assist you to your seat." Amelia inclined her head slightly, scanning Elise's expression for any trace of pity. She found none. "Thank you," Amelia said, her voice polite but guarded. Elise guided her through the narrow aisle with ease, her practiced movements erasing some of Amelia's apprehension. Passengers glanced up as Amelia passed, a few nodding respectfully, others returning to their screens and quiet conversations. Her seat, 2A, sat near the front of the cabin, a spacious first-class window spot. Elise paused beside it, stepping aside to give Amelia room to settle in. "Take your time," Elise said softly. "If you need anything during the flight, just let me know." Amelia nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I appreciate that." Once settled, Amelia adjusted her scarf and smoothed the fabric of her coat. The seat was comfortable, but the tension in her shoulders lingered. As she glanced out the window, the lights of the runway stretched across the plane's wing, long shadows dancing across the tarmac. Down below, a ground crew member signaled with steady hand motions, his orange vest fluorescent against the night. The quiet orchestration of airport life continued, and Amelia allowed herself a rare moment of solitude. Her thoughts drifted once again to Mark Lawson's offer. The idea of leading a task force gave her purpose, a chance to shape meaningful change instead of merely enduring each new challenge. But with that opportunity came expectations, heavy ones. Could she shoulder them again? Her mind circled back to Jenna and Brian's sneers. Their faces weren't unique. They were reflections of something larger. A culture that dismissed those who didn't fit neatly into preconceived molds. Could she dismantle that culture, piece by piece? Amelia's fingers tightened slightly around the armrest, the cool leather grounding her. She had faced these questions before. And though they were exhausting, the alternative was standing still. And Amelia Brooks had never been one to stand still. Amelia Brooks shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers tracing the smooth leather of the armrest as the plane prepared for takeoff. The weight of the day clung to her shoulders, heavier than her carry-on stored above. For so long, Amelia had prided herself on resilience, on her ability to rise above ignorance and move forward with grace. But today, that resilience felt like a heavier burden than usual. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft click of heels approaching from the aisle. Amelia glanced up just as a woman, likely in her mid-40s, appeared beside her. She wore her dark hair in a sleek bun, her tailored navy pantsuit exuding quiet confidence. The woman's eyes scanned the seat numbers until they landed on the one next to Amelia's. "Excuse me," the woman said smoothly, her tone polite but efficient. "This is my seat." Amelia nodded and shifted slightly to give her room, watching as the woman placed a briefcase in the overhead compartment with practiced ease. She lowered herself into seat 2B, exhaling softly as she smoothed her blazer. After a brief pause, the woman turned toward Amelia with a courteous smile. "Hi, I'm Celeste. Looks like we'll be seatmates tonight." Amelia returned the smile out of politeness. "Amelia." Celeste hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to continue the conversation. "Busy night, isn't it? I almost didn't make it through security. Those lines were brutal." Amelia gave a small nod. "It always feels that way." She wasn't particularly in the mood for small talk, but there was something about Celeste's demeanor that felt genuine. "You must travel a lot," Celeste said, glancing briefly at Amelia's wheelchair before quickly looking away. an almost imperceptible flicker of discomfort, as if she worried about seeming intrusive. "First class isn't exactly rare for you, I'm guessing?" Amelia let out a soft chuckle, the unexpectedness of the comment disarming her. "I do travel often," she replied, "mostly for work." Celeste smiled knowingly. "Same. Corporate training, lots of conferences, meetings, client visits. I practically live out of a suitcase." Amelia tilted her head slightly. "Corporate training? That must be interesting." "It has its moments," Celeste replied with a chuckle. "Though to be honest, most of my job is convincing people to unlearn bad habits. You'd be surprised how much resistance you get when you ask someone to reflect on their own behavior." The words hung in the air, striking Amelia in a way she hadn't expected. She gave a small nod, her mind drifting momentarily back to Jenna and Brian. "I imagine that can be challenging," Amelia said carefully. "It is," Celeste admitted, "but it's worth it when you see even the smallest shift in perspective. Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step forward matters." Amelia studied her seatmate more closely, curiosity tugging at the edges of her thoughts. Was this coincidence, or some strange twist of fate? The plane rumbled softly as it began to taxi toward the runway. The cabin lights dimmed, and the captain's voice filtered through the speakers with the usual announcements. Amelia fastened her seatbelt, the rhythmic hum of the engines growing louder beneath her. As the plane lifted off, Amelia felt the familiar weightlessness, that fleeting sense of separation from the world below. Through the window, the city lights glittered like distant jewels, fading beneath the haze of altitude. From up here, everything felt smaller, more manageable. But Amelia knew the distance was only temporary. The challenges waiting for her on the ground hadn't disappeared. They lingered just beneath the surface, waiting to resurface the moment the wheels touched down. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment of reprieve. The quiet hum of the cabin, the soft glow of overhead lights, they lulled her into a rare sense of peace. Tomorrow would bring its own set of questions, decisions, and battles. But tonight, Amelia let herself rest. The plane settled into cruising altitude, the cabin dark except for scattered reading lights. Amelia leaned back, letting her gaze drift to the window. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, stars faint but persistent against the black sky. Far below, the city lights had disappeared, leaving only vast expanses of darkness. The engines hummed steadily, a constant, unchanging backdrop to the stillness of the flight. Amelia exhaled softly as her body relaxed for the first time all day. The tension that had gripped her shoulders began to ease, but her mind remained restless. The events of the past few hours played over like a film reel she couldn't quite stop. Her eyes drifted toward the tray table, where a small glass of water sat untouched. The condensation glistened under the dim light, tiny droplets trailing down the side like miniature rivers. Amelia traced one with her eyes, following its slow, winding path. In the quiet of the cabin, even the simplest things felt grounding. Next to her, Celeste quietly opened her laptop, the faint glow illuminating her face as she began typing with quick, efficient strokes. After a few moments, Celeste glanced toward Amelia. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said softly, tilting the screen to dim the light. Amelia shook her head lightly. "Not at all. I've been enjoying the quiet." Celeste smiled, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. "It's rare to meet someone who carries themselves the way you do. There's a calmness about you." Amelia met her gaze, unsure of how to respond. "I guess I've learned to stay composed." "Experience has a way of teaching that," Celeste replied. "Especially when you've had to navigate things most people don't think twice about." There was something unspoken in her words, a quiet understanding that didn't need elaboration. Amelia studied her seatmate, sensing a depth to Celeste that wasn't immediately obvious. For the first time in hours, Amelia felt seen. The conversation drifted into a comfortable silence, and Amelia allowed herself to focus on the stars beyond the glass. Even the smallest lights, she thought, could shine through the darkest of skies. The glow from Celeste's laptop cast soft shadows along the narrow cabin, illuminating her focused expression as her fingers moved rapidly across the keys. Amelia Brooks shifted slightly in her seat, gazing out the window at the dark expanse beyond, but the weight of the day still lingered, heavy in her chest. After a few moments, Amelia noticed Celeste glance sideways, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Celeste said softly, tilting the screen downward to dim the light. "Sometimes I get so caught up in work that I forget there's someone next to me." Amelia shook her head gently, offering a small smile. "You're fine, I've been enjoying the quiet." Celeste returned the smile, but hesitation lingered in her eyes. She seemed to weigh her next words carefully. "If it's not too forward to say," she began, her tone light but sincere, "you have a very calm presence. It's rare to meet someone who carries themselves the way you do." The comment caught Amelia off guard. She turned towards Celeste, her expression unreadable. "I suppose I've learned how to stay composed," Amelia replied after a pause. "Life has a way of teaching you that." Celeste nodded, her gaze thoughtful but unobtrusive. "That's true. Composure often comes from experience, doesn't it? From navigating things most people don't even notice." Amelia studied her seatmate more closely, sensing curiosity without intrusion. There was something about Celeste's words that felt less like casual conversation and more like an invitation. Subtle, but genuine. For a brief moment, Amelia considered sharing more, letting the barrier between them drop, but the vulnerability that required felt like too much for now. Instead, she shifted the conversation. "What about you? Your work must give you plenty of opportunities to see things from different perspectives," Amelia said. Celeste's face softened as she leaned back slightly. "It does," Celeste admitted. "But it also shows me how resistant people can be to change. Sometimes it feels like I'm constantly fighting uphill battles, trying to get people to unlearn biases they don't even realize they have." Amelia tilted her head slightly, intrigued. "And what keeps you going?" she asked. Celeste's eyes drifted to the cabin ceiling for a moment, her expression distant but warm. "I guess it's the small victories," she replied. "Those rare moments when someone sees the world through a different lens, even if just for a second. Those moments make the effort feel worth it." Amelia nodded slowly. There was something about Celeste's words that resonated deeply, as if she had inadvertently voiced the quiet thoughts Amelia often carried. Their experiences, though different in nature, felt parallel in a way Amelia hadn't expected. The gentle rustling of footsteps interrupted their conversation. Elise, the flight attendant, moved silently through the cabin, checking on passengers. Her calm professionalism contrasted with the chaotic energy Amelia had encountered earlier that day. When Elise reached their row, she paused, offering a warm smile. "Miss Brooks," Elise said softly, "is there anything I can get for you? A blanket, perhaps?" Amelia shook her head. "I'm fine, thank you." Elise hesitated briefly, then leaned in just slightly. "If I may," she added gently, "I just wanted to say, it's an honor to have you aboard. Your work has inspired a lot of us in this industry." Amelia looked up, her features softening at the unexpected kindness. "Thank you," Amelia replied quietly. "That means a lot." Elise nodded before continuing down the aisle, her presence leaving behind a faint ripple of reassurance. Amelia watched her go, the flight attendant's words settling like a comforting weight. It wasn't the first time someone had acknowledged her work, but tonight it felt different. After a day overshadowed by frustration, the brief moment of recognition reminded Amelia why she had chosen this path in the first place. As the cabin dimmed and passengers settled in for the flight, Amelia found herself turning inward. Her thoughts drifted back to Mark Lawson's proposal. The idea of leading Crescent Air's accessibility task force felt like an opportunity to reshape the future, but it also came with the pressure of expectation. Would she be ready for the weight of that responsibility again? She thought of her younger self, the version of Amelia who had stepped into the world of advocacy with unshakable optimism. In those early days, she had believed change was simply a matter of effort and persistence. But time had tempered that optimism, chiseling it down into something quieter and more resilient. Even so, the flame hadn't gone out. Amelia's gaze drifted back to the window. Outside, the stars shimmered faintly, their light persistent against the deep black of night. Her mother's voice echoed faintly in her memory, a phrase Amelia had heard since childhood. "Even the smallest light can guide you through the darkest night." Beside her, Celeste had closed her laptop, folding her hands in her lap as she gazed absently ahead. The quiet that settled between them felt less like silence and more like understanding. Amelia closed her eyes briefly, letting the hum of the engines wash over her. There were still questions to answer. There always would be. But for the first time that day, the burden didn't feel quite so heavy. Amelia Brooks sat quietly as the plane descended, the soft hum of the engines wrapping around her like a cocoon. She didn't have all the answers, but one thing had crystallized in her mind. The events of today couldn't end with Rebecca and Brian's dismissal. That was just the beginning. If Amelia wanted to create lasting change, she couldn't let her frustration linger in silence. She needed to transform it into something larger, something that would outlive fleeting apologies. When the plane landed, she would call Mark Lawson. She would accept his offer, but it would be on her terms. This task force wouldn't be another corporate initiative lost to red tape. It would be a movement, a demand for accountability and systemic reform. For now, Amelia let herself breathe. Her resolve felt as steady as the stars outside her window. The night had been long, but morning always came, and with it, the chance to begin again. The wheels of the plane touched down smoothly, grounding Amelia in the present. Outside, the faint blush of dawn bathed New York City in a golden haze. Passengers murmured softly, gathering their bags and preparing to disembark. Amelia remained seated, taking a moment to absorb the quiet. The flight had brought her clarity, space to reflect on the whirlwind of the past 24 hours. She reached for her scarf, running her fingers along the soft fibers. It was a small, familiar comfort, a quiet reminder of resilience. Elise, the flight attendant, appeared at her side. Her warm, attentive presence had been a consistent thread throughout the journey. "Ms. Brooks, I hope your flight was comfortable," Elise said softly. "The captain asked me to let you know. Someone from the airline's executive team is waiting to meet you at the gate." Amelia raised an eyebrow, curiosity flickering in her gaze. "Thank you, Elise, and for everything else today." Elise smiled warmly, sincerity in her eyes. "It was an honor to serve you, ma'am, and thank you for everything you do." As Amelia made her way down the jet bridge, she was greeted by Mark Lawson himself. He stood near the gate, hands in his pockets, but every inch the composed CEO. Beside him, a younger woman held an envelope, her expression professional but polite. "Miss Brooks," Mark greeted her with a slight smile. "Welcome to New York. I hope the flight was restful." Amelia inclined her head. "Peaceful, at least." Mark's smile deepened faintly. "Good to hear. I wanted to personally thank you again for your patience and grace yesterday. How you handled the situation, it's left an impression, not just on me, but on many of our staff who have already heard what happened." Amelia studied him carefully, her expression calm but unwavering. "I appreciate that," she said, her voice even. "But as I mentioned, words are only the beginning. It's action that counts." Mark's face grew serious, his gaze steady. "I couldn't agree more. But before we move forward, I wanted to acknowledge what you endured in a more tangible way." He gestured to the woman beside him, who stepped forward, offering Amelia the envelope. "This is a token of our gratitude," Mark explained. "We're offering you an exclusive travel pass, unlimited flights for a year worldwide. First class, of course." Amelia blinked, caught off guard. Her fingers brushed the edge of the envelope, its weight solid and real. She lingered for a moment, letting the gesture settle in her mind. It wasn't just a pass, it was recognition. A quiet but powerful affirmation of her value and dignity. "Unlimited flights," she repeated softly as if testing the words. A small smile tugged at her lips. "That's unexpected, but appreciated." Mark's expression lightened slightly. "It's the least we can do. I hope it serves as a reminder. You're not just a passenger. You're a partner in making this industry more inclusive." Amelia accepted the envelope, the weight of it grounding her. She glanced up at Mark, sensing sincerity beneath his polished exterior. "Thank you," she said, her voice firm but grateful. "This is generous, but as you know, it's not the end of the story. I'll hold you to your promises, Mark. The task force, it needs to be more than just words." Mark's gaze didn't waver. He nodded firmly. "It will be," he said. "I'm looking forward to working alongside you to make it a reality." They exchanged a handshake, one that felt more like an agreement between equals than a simple greeting. As Amelia left the terminal, the cool New York air kissed her skin, carrying the faint scent of rain. She paused just outside, the envelope still in her hand. A quiet smile spread across her face. It wasn't about the flights, it was about reclaiming her space, in a world that so often tried to diminish it. The sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows over the city skyline. Amelia took one last glance at the envelope before forking it carefully into her bag. This was just the beginning. And for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to step into it. Amelia Brooks sat at the curb outside the terminal, the weight of the envelope resting lightly in her lap. The city around her buzzed with life. Taxi horns blared, hurried travelers tugged at their luggage, and the hum of conversation filled the crisp morning air. But amid the chaos, Amelia felt a quiet calm settle over her. The travel pass wasn't just a token of apology, it was an opportunity, a doorway she hadn't expected to open. For years, Amelia's advocacy had taken her to conferences, panels, and airports across the country, often at her own expense. The financial burden had never outweighed her resolve, but now unlimited travel meant she could expand her reach. She could amplify her voice and push for change in places she hadn't yet touched. But beyond the pass itself, Mark Lawson's promise lingered in her thoughts. His sincerity had seemed real, but the months ahead would reveal the truth. Would Crescent Air's culture shift? Would Rebecca and Brian's dismissal serve as a lesson, or would their actions be forgotten by the time the next flight boarded? Amelia wouldn't let it fade into memory. This wasn't just about her experience. It was about the countless others who had faced similar indignities without recourse or recognition. She had every intention of holding Mark to his word, not for herself, but for them. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, and the driver stepped out, his hands reaching for her bags with practiced ease. As he placed them in the trunk, Amelia maneuvered into the back seat, folding her wheelchair carefully beside her. The sound of the city softened as the car door closed. The hum of engines and footsteps gave way to the gentle, rhythmic motion of tires gliding along the avenue. Amelia leaned back, watching the city blur past. Her journey hadn't been easy. Far from it. She had fought battles both visible and hidden, navigating obstacles that extended beyond the physical. The prejudices she faced were as real as the chair she sat in. Yet, with every challenge, her resolve had grown. Each small victory, no matter how fleeting, reminded her why the fight mattered. The task force Mark envisioned wasn't just about accessibility. It was about dignity. It was about fostering a world where respect wasn't conditional, where people like her could exist without having to justify their worth. As the car rolled to a smooth stop in front of her hotel, the driver stepped around to open the door. Amelia nodded her thanks as she moved toward the entrance, the early sunlight catching the glass facade of the building. Inside, the city's vibrant energy pulsed through the lobby. Conversations buzzed, briefcases snapped shut, and the smell of coffee drifted faintly through the air. Amelia paused for a moment, taking it in, the good and the bad. The events of the past day had revealed both the worst of people and the best. There was cruelty, yes, but there was also compassion. Quiet gestures from strangers, the genuine remorse of a leader willing to acknowledge his mistakes, and the unwavering support of those who believed in her mission. It was enough to remind her why she did this work. In her room, Amelia settled by the window, gazing out at the sprawling skyline. The sun had risen fully now, casting golden light over the buildings, their long shadows stretching across the streets below. She unfolded the envelope once more, running her fingers over the embossed lettering of the travel pass. To anyone else, it might have looked like a simple piece of paper. But for Amelia, it was more than that. It was recognition, an acknowledgement that her voice had been heard. But it was also a reminder of the work that lay ahead. Setting the pass carefully on the desk beside her laptop, Amelia opened a blank document. The cursor blinked, waiting. She took a deep breath and began to type, outlining a vision for the task force she would lead. Every word carried the weight of her experiences, her hopes, and the unwavering belief that change wasn't just possible, it was necessary. Amelia knew the journey was far from over. But as she gazed out at the horizon, she realized something she hadn't felt in a long time. The world felt open. No barriers, no limits, just possibilities. And Amelia Brooks was ready to soar. Amelia's story didn't end with justice alone. It continued with hope, a powerful reminder that dignity and respect should never be negotiable. Her courage, persistence, and belief in change became a catalyst, sparking conversations and reforms that reached far beyond a single flight. Even in the face of adversity, resilience shines through. If Amelia's story inspired you, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories that matter. Thank you for watching.